Ayla, I'm gonna log out and come back in, try to get my camera working.
Okie doke. We'll start up in just a minute here.
Once again, my camera's not working on my computer.
That can be frustrating.
It chooses. One day it decides it's working, another day it decides it's not working.
Oh, son of a gun. There. Open full screen, full screen. Okie dokie. What are we diving into here? We are going to dive into hardscape. If we look at, what do I want to look at? Look at this. Share the screen. And we go into I have too many tabs open. See how hard I've been working? Damn it, I really have too many open. That sure is strange. Anyways, if we go into, let's go to here, Dropbox. So if we go into this, this again is the one of the proposals we looked at. Actually, this one doesn't have any infrastructure in it. But in terms of like, let me dive into one that does have infrastructure. This is a good one. This one. Yeah, so this is a good example, and I've shown you guys the proposals before. So in terms of phasing, again, we've talked really minorly about earthwork, primarily in just grading. And the reason that I sort of like grazed over it is it's hard to really conceptualize the earthwork portion of it until we've talked about the concrete and masonry portion of it. So going through there's typically demolition, then earthwork, then drainage and conduits, which is really the infrastructure portion we talked about last week. And usually at this point, that's when we begin to start building our landscapes back up again. The demolition and earthwork is typically breaking things and removing things. And then the earthwork is getting to our subgrade. And then infrastructure are all items that are going to go underground below all of our hard surfaces, and the rest of the garden for that matter. And it's at the concrete and masonry portion or hardscape portion that we're typically building back up again. In this case, there was only, about $4,000 worth of work that was done as part of like the earthwork and infrastructure portion, which is about 10% of this job. This job really should have been about 60,000. And proportionately, the earthwork and drainage and conduits would have been probably 10%. Anyways, essentially, you can anticipate that clients will be not outrageously excited until you start into the concrete and masonry portion. And that's really because all they've seen is some stuff removed, a bunch of soil getting moved around, and then a bunch of stuff put in the ground, and then everything covered up so that all they can see is like the tops of pipes popping up here and there. And they've paid, they're already like minimum of 10%, sometimes up to 40% into the cost of the project at that point. So the concrete and masonry portion is a major portion. It's usually what people think about when they're thinking of landscape and landscape projects and their amazing backyard or their amazing park or whatever it is. They're easy to, they're quick to forget the portion of the project that is the plants and all of the softscape portion and sort of the piece that we would think of normally as being the horticulture piece of what a landscape is. So the concrete and masonry portion is a major portion. It's a major expense. It's typically the highest per square foot price tag on the project. So a lot of money moves around very quickly during this portion. For my proposals, I try to be in design build where the contractor is the designer and they build it as well. In the proposal, as I've mentioned before, it's very important to describe in depth and in detail, because really these are replacing construction documents and details. It's really important to describe what it is that is going to happen. So in this case, it was a patio that was going to get installed. It's a colored light broom finish concrete patio. The concrete is going to be a 6-sack, 3/4 by 1/2 aggregate blend with stealth fiber and 1 pound of integral color. The concrete will be 4 inches thick with 1/2 inch steel reinforcing bars set at 18 inches on center each way on 2-inch dobies set on 3 inches compacted road base. Okay. Now, if you've never dealt with concrete, a lot of this is foreign, right? It's a lot of gobbledygook that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And what I want to do is start to get this to make sense. It takes a really long time to get really good at concrete. And My recommendation is if you're gonna just be gutsy and jump into this industry and be a design build contractor for yourself, hire people to do your concrete work until you're comfortable doing your concrete work. It took me a long time to be comfortable doing my own concrete work, and still occasionally I run into some issues, and they are incredibly expensive issues. So just be aware of that. There's a couple other pieces on this. There was some board formed concrete walls on this one. And as I've shown you guys, other proposals that are those long run-on paragraphs describing what's going to happen, typically they don't detail what is going to happen in that paragraph. I find that it's very helpful to describe in writing exactly what the clients are going to be getting, so that there's really no questions. You still have to explain it, but having it in the proposal as part of a contract, in my opinion, is very important. So in this case, and hopefully we'll get to discussing walls today, but in this case, this was 24-inch tall by 6-inch thick elevated planter walls. The walls are to have 12-inch by 18-inch concrete footing, half-inch steel reinforcing bars set at 6 inches on center, horizontally and 12-inch vertically, 6-sack, 3/4, half-inch aggregate blend with stealth fiber, and 1 pound integral color. Okay, so that integral color means that there will be either a liquid or a powder color in the concrete mix itself when it comes on the truck. The aggregate is the gravel in the concrete. And then the 6-sack portion is the amount of cement added to that mix. And I always separate my concrete pump service fees. I think it's really important to do because sometimes you can pull off a much larger pour than expected, depending on weather or finisher availability. And sometimes it's way too hot to pour, 1,500 square feet in a day with a limited amount of finishers. So I leave that portion kind of not up in the air, but I state what it is. And if I need to split the pours into different days, then I can do that. And it's already known how much additional it will be. Okay, so let's dive into concrete and masonry part 1. And this is display settings, swap. There we go. And I'm starting on the wrong one. Okay, so still in sustainable landscape construction. So throughout this, I want to make sure that we have this underlying understanding of sustainability, as well as the other understanding that this portion of the project is typically the least sustainable portion of the project, okay? But also looking at different ways that we can make it more sustainable and not be wasteful, try to create something that is well built and long lasting, right? That's like the piece that like you can weigh out here, in that while the majority of hardscape construction, so concrete and masonry construction, in a million is an exaggeration, but in many, many different ways, it's really not a earth-friendly activity. But by making sure that we're building it in a way that, at a bare minimum, is well built and long lasting, that's how we sort of justify the majority of this activity, if we're going to be taking some of the like less sustainable approaches to it. So hardscape also, like, you know, hardscape and concrete and masonry are typically like interchangeable. Hardscape is really the harder surfaces of a landscape project. Flat work portions of these are considered patios or pool decks, walkways, driveways, sidewalks. And then the like non-flat work portions of these were typically associated with walls. Concrete is used in many different ways. Stone can be used. Concrete and masonry units can be used, also concrete, but sort of a different way to build things. Mortarless retaining walls, and then etc. There's a lot of ways to build walls. In terms of like price tag, flat work, patios, walkways, etc. Any kind of hard surface, typically it's a high dollar per square foot. Once you go vertical with anything, it's higher per square foot. It's a more expensive activity. It's a more expensive product that you're putting together. So if we look specifically at flat work, being essentially flat on the ground, we're again thinking of patios and walkways and driveways, etc. And there's a lot of ways that these flat work portions can be put together, or how they're actually built. So different common materials that we use essentially boil down to two products. It's either stone, I guess just one product. It's either stone or stone, right? There's concrete, there's stone, like listed on here. There's concrete, there's stone, there's concrete interlocking pavers, there's decomposed granite, there's gravel, and there's some others, but really like these are the 5 most commonly used. And I was gonna say that there's, in terms of material options, that there's stone and there's concrete, but concrete's just made up of different sizes of stone, and then a particular stone that is transformed into a cement, but they're all stone based. Yeah, it's all stone based, but these are like what people would think of as different materials. So concrete, stone, interlocking concrete pavers, decomposed granite, and gravel. So hardscape really, like, it's very important for any flat, hard surface to have slope. And we've talked just a little bit about slope already, but I've managed to skirt around the issue pretty well. Once we get through this, we will go more in depth on slope, and we'll actually do some calculations, not to like a painful degree, but to a degree that you can understand it or begin to understand it. So again, hardscape surfaces need slope. Smoother surfaces like a broom finish concrete or a sand finish concrete or a smooth concrete, they can have a lesser slope or a more slight slope, being a 1% or a 1.5% slope. Smoother or rougher surfaces like stamped concrete or stone, they should have a 2% slope on them. Now the slope is so that when water gets on these surfaces, because we're assuming that they're outside, sometimes though they're not outside and they should still have slope unless it's in a house. We need to move that water off of that surface, okay? Water on a surface long-term is dangerous, as well as it can make your surface or your material weaker. So in the case of concrete, if you have a long-standing puddle on concrete that stays there over a long period of time and it freezes and thaws, then that can do a really good job of flaking off the top portion of the concrete, that's the smooth portion of the concrete, and it'll expose the aggregate below it, which is not only unsightly, but it can be rough enough to a point where it's not safe to walk on. And in addition to that, if you have like a long-standing wet spot or puddle on your concrete, then you can also have a really slippery spot, right? If it freezes, somebody slips on ice, that's not good, it's dangerous. If it just becomes like a slick, mossy mess, then that's also dangerous, okay? So the slope is very important, just to generally move water around and away from a building or a structure that could get damaged by water penetration. Other spots that you need to slope away from are pools. You don't want water that's landing on the surrounding hard surface of a pool to flow into the pool. You want it to flow away from the pool because that's controlled water. And then last on this slide is hard surfaces should have an aggregate base, also known as some sort of base rock. Sorry, I didn't have my chat open here, but I saw one pop up, so I will pop it up here. Let's see. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate it. Yeah. The sack quantity represents the amount of cement proportionate to the mix. So I think it's in a ton of, I think it's per ton. Anyways, I'll get it. Essentially, the higher the sack mix, the stronger the concrete because it has more cement in it. A lot of times, especially with clients, and I don't tend to correct clients when they say this, but a lot of times they'll say, this is great, when are you gonna put down the cement? Cement is one of the ingredients to concrete. What you're actually putting down is concrete. And we'll get more into what aggregate bases are, or base rock, a little bit later. But it is important to know that typically, and this varies regionally, typically base rock or an aggregate base should be used under a hard surface, being a concrete surface or a stone surface, etc. Pavers for sure. We will get into those materials later. Really what I'm trying to expose you to now is the products, the materials that are most typically used. So concrete is probably the most widely used. Concrete is a mixture of cement, also known as Portland cement, aggregate, and sand. So on this picture here, actually in all of them, but this one's like a pretty good like depiction of it. he's doing like the initial float on this. This is probably between pours. But what you can see is the top of this concrete looks a lot smoother than sort of this rocky, sandy, pasty looking stuff. And what you really see on the smoother area is sort of the cement and water portion of the concrete. And that gets sort of pulled to the surface with different finishing trowels. And that is the portion that's actually finished. What you see in this rougher looking area and in the other two pictures is the complete mixture of cement, aggregate, and sand. Also water's added to this, and that actually activates it. And there is a chemical reaction that happens between the cement and the water. And it's such a heavy chemical reaction that it actually really does get warm. So if you're receiving your concrete and it feels warm, it means that it's been mixing for a while and you got to finish it quick, because the chemical reaction that's happening within that solution or that mixture is ready to set up. And so you don't have a whole lot of time.
So the concrete itself actually starts to get warm.
Oh yeah.
Huh.
Yep. Yeah, you can feel it. Like, I had an issue with a pumper one time. I had a pumper not show up for a project that we really needed a pump on. And the finishers were there and they're waiting. And finally, we just said, you know what, like, we need to wheelbarrow this stuff in, because they kept feeling the side of the concrete truck, and you can feel the heat in it. And once it gets to a certain point, like, it's a loss, you know, like you can't get that concrete down and finish it. And that it's a really expensive loss. I mean, typically like a full concrete truck is, you know, $2,000 to $3,000 plus, depending on what kind of mix you have in there. So yeah, it actually gets warm. The aggregate is essentially gravel. Okay, so it's a fancy name for gravel. And in my specifications, I always include a 3/4 and a 1/2 inch gravel. Typically with stamped concretes, they typically just use a pea gravel size. So like a 3/8 size concrete, aggregate or gravel. I very much prefer a mixture of different sizes of aggregates because it tends to make the concrete itself stronger. Because instead of having all the same size aggregate next to each other, you have some larger aggregates and then some smaller aggregates that can fill in between it. And so you have a much better distribution of the aggregate and sand and cement. But really, cement or concrete is this combination of cement, aggregate, and sand. Also, what you see here, what you actually see here is on the lower two pictures is reinforcing bar, reinforcing steel bar, or rebar. What you actually see in these two pictures is rewire. Okay, this comes in panels. It looks a lot like hog panels that are used for fencing, or welded wire panels that are used for fencing. And it's pretty darn close to the same thing. It's just a steel product that's welded together. Doesn't come in long bars like I think we're used to seeing rebar in. But rebar is installed into the concrete mix as it's being poured, typically in the middle portion of it, so that it can reinforce the concrete. So again, concrete is cement, aggregate, sand. The qualities, the concrete, and kind of why it's been used, it's the most commonly used building material in the world. It's been used, I don't know, I'm not a history teacher, but it has been used for an incredibly long time. It has a very high compressive strength, which means that it doesn't crush easily, okay? Compressive strength is compression, and you're pushing on it, and it doesn't crush easily. It does, however, have a very low tensile strength, so tension strength. And tensile strength is the ability to be able to pull a material apart. So concrete has a very strong compressive strength, but a very weak tensile strength. So it can break apart very easily. Most of the elements used or the ingredients in concrete are locally sourced and raw materials. So gravel is typically relatively locally sourced. It's typically sourced from areas that are within 200 miles of wherever this material is going to be installed. Sand, the same thing. It's typically sourced from a relatively close proximity. They are raw materials. So these aren't reused materials. These aren't recycled materials typically. They're raw materials that are mined. Okay, these are coming out of a riverbed, an old riverbed, or a hillside. So, you know, whatever the method to get the aggregate and sand is, it is kind of pulling natural resources out of our earth in order to put this product together. Now, again, the upside to this product is that, or this material is that it is very long lasting and is very durable. So that's the sustainable portion of it. The last piece of this, which is probably the least sustainable piece to it, least sustainable ingredient in concrete, because it has a really high carbon footprint, is the Portland cement portion. It's a limestone that's heated to a very, very, very high temperature. And so it breaks down into an incredibly fine powder. And the process of heating it to that really high temperature is where the carbon outputs go. Okay, so you have to use carbon in order to heat the limestone up to a very high temperature in order to create the cement portion of the product. Now, again, it's justified because, well, it's justifiable because the product that you're actually creating with it should be long lasting and durable. Now, certain options are encouraged, such as the use of slag or the use of potash as a replacement, not entirely, but a portion of the cement, okay? So if you were to do a high potash or high slag concrete mix, you would typically be replacing some of that 6-sack mixture that I typically specify with, you know, it'd be 4 sacks of cement 2 sacks of slag or potash. And
what is slag and potash specifically, and what's the value of utilizing them in pour?
excellent and perfect question, Laura. So potash and slag are both materials or ingredients that act the same way as cement does in when mixed with water and added to the other 2 ingredients will create concrete. And it actually will create an incredibly strong concrete. Typically, the high slag and potash content concretes are very, very strong. In fact, the way that you can increase strength of concrete is to use slag or potash, and I'll get to what they actually are in a minute. But the compressive strength of concrete is 2,800 PSI, okay? So once concrete has completely cured, and it takes 28 days for it to completely cure, it has a compressive strength of 2,800 PSI per square inch, right? So essentially that means you can place on a 1-inch portion of concrete 2,800 pounds, almost 1.5 ton of material on it, and it shouldn't break, okay? It shouldn't crush. The more slag, well, the more cement you add to it, so if you go from a 6 to a 7 to an 8 sack mix, the more compressive strength there is in that concrete. There's other admixtures that you can add to concrete that can increase the compressive strength. And some of those admixtures are slag or potash. Slag is a byproduct of the steel industry. So when they're making steel, they have to heat it up to a really, really high temperature. Same as cement, right? But to make steel, you have to heat it up to a very high temperature, and it produces essentially like a soot to it, which is called slag. And that slag is so fine that it can replace or supplement the amount of cement used. So the reason that it's considered more sustainable, and in fact in LEED certifications, so leadership in energy and I don't know if anybody knows the second E in that one, efficiency, whatever the second E in LEED is. In the LEED programs, like the rating program, you get points if you use concrete that either has a high slag or a high potash content. So cement, Portland cement, it's specifically heated to a high temperature to make the cement. Thank you, Laura. Energy and environmental design. I maybe would have gotten there, but that was much more efficient. Cement is heated up to a very high temperature just for the sole purpose of making cement, right? Slag is a byproduct that just happens to be made as part of the steel industry, right? And so it's a byproduct of something that's already happening and can be used to supplement it, right? And that's why it feels more sustainable. Potash is similar. Potash is a byproduct of the coal industry. So when they're burning coal, they can capture some of the smoke, and essentially what builds up is potash. And that potash is so fine that it can be, again, same as slag and same as cement, it can be used to supplement that cement. And again, it's a byproduct of something else that's already happening. Now, LEED certifications and these types of programs, a lot of times there'll be a municipality that requires more sustainable practices for builders. And so if they're building a high-rise building or a parking garage or something like that, there'll be a requirement that high slag content or potash content concrete be used. And, you know, I think we're all fortunate to live in California where that piece is really important to us, right? To be sustainable, to make sure that we make these changes that will make it so that we're screwing things up less than we already are, right? I mean, that's the goal. So California is a lot more popular with LEED certifications. There's a lot of other states that are very, very forward thinking along these lines as well. California is not the only one. But so when going for a LEED certification or to be more sustainable, and I have read in a lot of municipal codes that you have to use high slag or high potash content. But you know, I'm no like concrete genius. I've just done it enough to know how risky it is, but to manage to have like a controlled risk to the concrete being installed. And I think I've mentioned to you guys that I finally got to a point where I'm not like too proud or scared to ask tons of questions about you know, the products. Use the experts, use your vendors to help you understand how to make the right decisions and to limit your risk in what you do. So I really learned about this portion, the slag and the potash. I always knew that they are byproducts of different industries, but in talking to my favorite concrete supplier, which is Milpitas Materials out of Milpitas, California. So if I'm pouring in the Bay Area, anywhere south of Hillsboro and north of Morgan Hill, I always use Milpitas Materials. And so you end up, you know, you can call them, you can ask them a million questions. They're there to help. They want to sell you this truckload of stuff that will go out to your project and it's filled with $3,500 for them, right? Like they're selling you a product and they want their product to be right. So I talked to the mix specialist there, this really smart woman, that about slag and potash. Now, think about this. We're in California. Where do you think the nearest coal plant is?
Exactly.
Right? That coal plant is probably, my guess is probably Midwest, right? We don't have coal plant. I don't think we have coal plants in California.
Right? Sam says Wyoming.
It's Wyoming? Wow. Huh, thanks, Sam. Sam is just a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate that. Everybody else too, but Sam, you know some interesting things. Anyways, they're coming from a very like long distance, right? So think about that offset. There's this product that can supplement the cement that we're using, but it has to come from a really far distance. And so there's a carbon, there's like an add to that travel time. And that stuff's not light, right? It needs to travel either on train, truck, or boat. Typically, it's coming on boats from the East Coast through the Panama Canal and up to good old California, because we want to be sustainable, right? But oftentimes we're not thinking about that portion. Now, the other piece to this is that potash is phasing out because there's less and less coal being utilized to create energy. So there's less and less potash available. There still is, however, a lot of slag that's available. However, same deal. When we're getting steel in California, the majority of the time, it's coming from the East Coast or somewhere Midwest, okay? So major manufacturing happens in other states. And a lot of times, if we're bringing our slag in, it's typically not coming from as far as potash would come, but it's still coming from a really, really far distance. So, you know, there's this feel-good part where we're saying, well, we're using less carbon in California because we're not burning that that limestone down into Portland cement. We're not doing it here, but it's happening somewhere else. And again, it's good because it's a byproduct, but the downside to it is that it has to travel. It's a very heavy product that has to travel a great distance to be able to get here. So that sustainable aspect of it is more or less there, right? I'd say maybe a little bit less there. And the concrete vendors, they know that. When I talked to the woman at Milpitas Materials, she said, yeah, it looks great on paper and it's a requirement for a lot of projects, but you know, they never asked like where we get it from. And the places that they're getting it from, they're getting it pulled in from the East Coast, which I always find, you know, pretty interesting, you know. Anyways, so that's the story on concrete for the most part. Now, the next portion to concrete, which again, this is a regional thing, but I have not succumbed to this region's practices, is rebar. Okay, so reinforcing steel bar, also known as rebar. What rebar is used for is used to reduce cracking in concrete. You can see this picture up here. That's concrete. You can see the cracks in it. Concrete, inherently, it naturally cracks, okay? Now we put rebar in concrete to try to minimize the cracking. The reason that rebar is used, it's steel, okay? It's a steel product. And the reason that it's used is because it has a high tensile strength, okay? Remember back up to the concrete portion, it has a high compressive strength, but a very low tensile strength. Add steel to it and you get a high tensile strength, okay? So you improve that material's ability to not be pulled apart by putting steel into it. And the reason it's steel that's used is because steel and concrete have the same expansion and contraction rates. So any material has an expansion and contraction rate. Wood is a really good example. If you build a fence in the wintertime and you're doing board to board, so you're butting the boards right up next to each other, and it's wintertime, so there's a lot of moisture in those boards. In the summertime, those boards shrink. Okay, they're going to shrink up because there's no moisture in it. And you're going to have gaps between those boards. So wood has a very visible expansion and contraction rate that you can see based on how dry or how wet the air is really. The flip side of that is if in the summertime you're building a fence and you're putting in a fence with the board to board that is butted right up to each other, and it's dry wood. In the wintertime, when that expands, then you can get some real buckling and cracking in that fence, because there's no gap there for it to grow into or expand into. And so you get that wood pushing right up against it, and it'll tend to crack or buckle out. Okay. Now, concrete and steel, they don't have like a visible expansion and contraction rate, but they still have an expansion and contraction rate. And the reason that they work so well together, where you embed steel into concrete, is because they have the same expansion and contraction rate. And so they get larger and smaller with heat and moisture at the same exact rate. Now, in all of my concrete, I always put steel reinforcing bars. I always put reinforcing bars or rebar. I know that in the majority of the work in Sacramento that happens, I see rebar get put in around pool coping, but not necessarily in a pool deck. And, you know, to be honest, it tends to work really well. You know, like as long as it's jointed well, then you can encourage those cracks to go into specific spots. So that last bullet point on this slide is joints, okay? And this picture in the lower right corner here is a walkway that has score joints in it. And these are called control joints. What you're trying to do is control where the concrete is going to crack by essentially like creating a perforation, a lot like, you know, a paycheck, right? You get a paycheck and on the top of it is the statement, and then on the bottom portion of it, there's the check, and you can rip that off. Sorry, somebody's calling me. Somebody about a tree. So yeah, there's a perforation in that paper that allows it to be easily ripped off of the rest of it without it ripping your statement off, right? I was gonna say like a PG&E bill or something like that, but I know not many of us get those bills anymore. And I mean, like if my kid opened one of those up, they wouldn't even know what to do with it, because they don't open letters except for when it's from grandma, and they certainly wouldn't understand what a perforated piece of paper is. But that's essentially like what you're doing when you're scoring concrete, when you're putting joints in concrete. You are creating a line within that concrete that it will want to crack at, okay? And you're trying to get that crack to go into that joint. And it's pretty effective. Although sometimes concrete does just weird things and it cracks in a spot where you're like, I can't believe it cracked there. So, you know, that's part of it. It's concrete, it's kind of a beast that way. But, you know, once you get used to really scoring concrete and creating score joint patterns to conform to where concrete will want to break, then you can get pretty close to avoiding cracks. Yeah, so that's why joints are installed in concrete. It's gonna crack, and so you're trying to control where it's gonna crack. There's other types of joints that are put into concrete. there's what's called a cold joint, which is where you have one section of concrete that's already poured and set up, and then you pour another section of concrete up to it, okay? Those are not connected at all. They'll tend to move independently of each other, and there's already a crack there. So it's called a cold joint. A lot of times you'll run steel through that, and then maybe so that out of the original pour, there's steel, and then the new pour, it can bite onto that steel. While there's still like a cold joint there, that steel will hold on to the next piece of concrete so that if there's any like differential settling in it, that one doesn't end up lower than the other. There's also expansion joints, and expansion joints are where typically they're used in huge concrete pours. They're typically used intermittently, because in these massive sections of, typically every 25 feet or so in like a parking lot or, outside a Walmart, those kind of places where there's like mass expanses of concrete. And what that is it's a spot that has some expansion ability so that that concrete can like shift and move without cracking the other concrete. Typically those are sort of filled in with what's called a mastic, or almost it typically looks like a caulking. It's very effective. Usually in residential builds, we don't end up with expansion joints except for a driveway meets a sidewalk, or a driveway meets the concrete floor of the garage, or where a patio meets the house foundation. Those are spots in smaller scale and larger scale residential builds that we would see expansion joints. And you can use either foam, or, which I prefer, or felt. Okay, so you start to keep your eyes open next time you walk into the supermarket. Right when you're walking across like the outside sidewalk and going into the store itself, look at that division, and you'll probably see that there's an expansion joint there. Look at the joint patterns in areas, in sidewalks. Typically a sidewalk is about 4 foot wide, and there's score joints every 4 feet. So they're essentially like broken up into 4 foot chunks of concrete. And that is very effective, except for when a tree root buckles it up, right? And that happens. That's poor tree selection. But maybe it's not their fault, right? There's a lot of things at play there. Anyways, joints in concrete is very important. This next slide shows different approaches on joints and different approaches to concrete. So concrete, it can get finished in a lot of different ways. This upper right-hand picture it's almost an exposed aggregate. It's really kind of a very heavy sand finish. It's more rough. It looks a lot like aged concrete. So if you're walking through a neighborhood that's very old and the concrete sidewalks have been in for a very long time, a lot of times you'll see concrete that looks a lot like this. That's because through time, concrete weathers, cement breaks down when it's exposed to elements, and you lose some of it, and then the sand begins to be exposed, okay? There's a lot of ways to achieve this. The newest, latest, greatest way is a product called Top Cast. It's essentially a surface retardant where after the concrete is laid and finished, a chemical gets painted onto it essentially, and it retards the curing or prevents the curing at the very top portion of the concrete. So the cement doesn't cure there. And the next day you power wash it off, and you wash off that chemical as well as the that what's called cream portion of the cement. You end up with this sand finish. This is a very heavy sand finish. I prefer a very light sand finish or a light acid wash finish, which is another way that this look is achieved. Is you can acid wash it after it's set up. About 4 days afterwards, you can use muriatic acid at a 10% dilution ratio. So 10% muriatic acid, which is the acid that people use for pools, so 1 part muriatic acid to 9 parts water. And you can put that on concrete and scrub the heck out of it, and essentially remove the cream portion after the fact. It is a risky one to do because if you don't scrub well enough or you miss a spot, you can end up with weird color splotches if you're using colored concrete. And the reason I know that is because I've screwed it up before. Luckily though, my hero, Larry the Sandblaster from Santa Cruz Sandblasting, can come in and save the day with that. In fact, he's saved us from a couple intentional and unintentional acid washings that were potentially incredibly expensive, but you pay Larry $1,000 and he fixes it for you. So Larry's a sandblaster, and he comes in a minimum of 4 days after the concrete has been poured and finished, and he'll sandblast it. And it's my preferred way to achieve the sand finish look because it's controlled by a person who's really good at what they do, so they can see what they're actually doing. And I do this because that's how they hold the hose. So you can actually, the sandblaster can see and sort of feel how the concrete is etching under the sandblast, and they have control over it. Whereas with concrete, with an acid wash, you're working with a chemical, and things can go wrong. So I did used to only use an acid wash, and it was because I worked with a group of finishers that were so good at acid washing, and it's the least expensive way that you can do it. But after a couple, after those guys don't work together anymore and I can't find them, and so now I bring in Larry the Sandblaster. In fact, he's coming up in a week and a half to blast the concrete up on one of my Penryn projects. So anyways, couple ways to achieve this sand finish look. And this again is a very heavy sand finish look. This is not my preferred look, but it is a sand finish. The upper left-hand picture is a combination of a smooth border. You can see joints in it. And then between that smooth border, they have kind of a heavy broom finish to it. So the way that they achieved this was they laid down the concrete, they screeded it, so they made it flat. They went over it with a couple different types of trowels, and then they did a light finish on it with a steel trowel. They cut in the joints, then they drag a broom over it, and then they went over those joints with an edging tool so that it made these edges or borders smooth. it's a good, inexpensive way to get some pattern into the concrete. The reason that people use broom finish a lot is because it'll erase any of the trowel marks and erase any imperfections, as well as it gives it just a little bit of texture to the concrete so that it's not as slippery. The lower left-hand picture here is, it looks also like a broom finish on the interior, and then they have a stamped concrete border, okay? So the way that they did that was, instead of using an integral color concrete, they used a plain concrete, and then they dusted color onto this border and stamped it. The two middle, upper and lower pictures, these are all stamped concrete examples. So the reason, I guess lower right as well, the reason that you use, you have to put a heavier slope onto concrete that is stamped is because the indentions of that stamp will tend to hold water. And so you need to tilt that just a little bit more to make sure that that water comes off of the patio or walkway or whatever it is. Stamping, became incredibly popular 15, 20 years ago, when they started to make some really cool stamping, some really cool stamps. And, it does look very stone-like, some better than others. And it is a way to get some good texture into concrete and make it not look, I guess, so plain. Yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that. The process on it is that you finish the concrete much like you would for a broom finish, but after it's set up a little bit but still able to receive a stamp, they before they're finished troweling, they dust in color. So they take what's called a color hardener, which is a powder product, and they throw it onto the wet concrete, and then they trowel that in. And that brings color in, as well as it makes the top portion of that concrete a much higher compressive strength than concrete all by itself. It's a color hardening color. Color hardening? Yeah, it's a color hardening powder. So you can actually get much more vibrant color out of it than integral color, where the color comes in the concrete mix. It does make this concrete much more gives it a much higher compressive strength. And typically they'll trowel that in, and then before they put the stamps down on it, they will dust on an additional color. Okay, and that's where, like on this, the upper middle and the lower right pictures, you can see that there's some variation to the color itself. It's not just texture in there, it's variation in color. And so typically that additional dust on color doesn't get troweled into the surface. It's just dusted right onto the top of the surface. And so it only imprints or gets put into the concrete at the spots where it pushes down in the hardest. And that's why you see at the lower portions of this stamp, you see it kind of a deeper color that gives it more contrast. This one as well, even though the resolution's pretty poor.
Can it wear over time?
One more time?
Can it wear off, the color wear off over time?
You bet it can. And eventually it all ends up looking like the initial colored concrete. Reason for that is that it's not actually like physically integrated into the concrete itself. And then it is sort of an unstable color or method to achieving the color. So it does tend to break down in sunlight, in UV light relatively quickly. And that's why when you get stamped concrete, it's always recommended that you seal the concrete, and that's to protect it. I prefer just a simple colored concrete with a sand finish, no stamp. And I prefer to not seal concrete. Sealing any kind of stone or concrete surface can tend to be very problematic because what you're doing is you're sealing the very top layer of it, right? The bottom layer of it is in contact with ground, which in the wintertime gets wet and it absorbs moisture. And as it absorbs moisture, there's salts in it. And that can push the salts up and out of the concrete. And if you have it sealed, then you can tend to get white clouding under the sealer. And if it's not sealed, you get some white clouding and you wash it off. It's called efflorescence. It comes through in the sand or the aggregate. You see it come through in brick a lot. You get a lot of efflorescence in brick. And it doesn't last forever, but you do have to clean it off or you appreciate the aged look of it. If it is, if it's sealed, then you end up with this cloudy appearance under the sealer. So I prefer, my preference, and this is just me, if you like stamped concrete, then stamp away, you know, like you can do some really cool things with it. But I prefer just to let concrete be concrete. And you know, I personally think it's a very beautiful product. And I know not everybody does. So, you know, I just let it be and I will not seal it. The sealer needs to be removed and replaced periodically, or it ends up flaking a little bit and you can see where it's flaked. So I think it's just more hassle than it's worth. So I just prefer not to do it. So that is it for now on concrete. Okay. It is, again, in my opinion, it's just a really great product, despite the fact that we have to throw carbon into the atmosphere in order to create it. What's really being done is, you know, if done right, you are creating a surface that's gonna last for a very long time. And that's my justification to using it. In terms of cost, for hard surfaces, it's one of the least costly materials. So a plain concrete like the one in the upper left, usually about 10 to 13 bucks a square foot. Add some color to that. It's 12 to 15 bucks a square foot. Sandblast it. It's 14 to 18 bucks a square foot. And stamped concrete typically comes in within about that range. So 12 to 16, 17 bucks a square foot. So an expensive piece, but not obscene, right? It's a reasonable cost for a hard, long-lasting, durable surface. In terms of concrete colors, there's a lot of different types of concrete color. There's different manufacturers. Each plant They tend to carry Davis or Schofield colors, but there are La Habra colors, etc. I keep a stack brochures with me. This is Davis color. I also have, for about 60 bucks, 70 bucks, you can get this from Davis color, which has pretty much all of their colors. So this is silver smoke, and you get like a swatch to it, right? So it's an actual chip of concrete. This shows a smooth finish on one side, and then a rough broom finish on the other side, so that clients can actually like see what it should look like. You can also go Davis concrete color. And you can look at the various colors. It is very, so we were just looking at silver smoke. Two different ways to achieve silver smoke, right? So, I mean, based on like what I can see on Zoom, what I'm holding up looks quite similar, not the same, but similar to what you're seeing on the computer or on my shared screen. It's really, really important to get the clients to understand that Davis Colors makes this as the swatch. They have this color on their color chart online. They have this thing here that clearly states that this right here is the base color. Now, because I mentioned earlier that the aggregates, so the gravel that goes into the concrete and the sand is sourced locally, that means that that's all going to affect the color of the concrete. So silver smoke color coming from Folsom Ready Mix and silver smoke color coming from Milpitas Ready Mix, they're going to come out a little bit different. Okay, and it's very important for clients to understand that. It will not look exactly like this, but it'll look pretty close. Okay, and again, it's because the ingredients that make up that concrete, the cement, the aggregate, and the sand, all have these different properties geographically. And where Folsom Ready Mix is pulling their sand and gravel from is very different than from where Milpitas Materials is pulling their sand and gravel from. So the ultimate appearance of the concrete is going to be lighter or darker. One other thing to note on here is that there's two ways to achieve these gray colors. So you see here that there's silver smoke carbon and silver smoke iron oxide, silver or light gray carbon and light gray iron oxide. So what that refers to, here's dark gray carbon and iron oxide. The carbon is a much less expensive way to color concrete gray, but it's very unstable. So prolonged sun exposure will bleach out that color. So it's much better to go with the color 860. In fact, I don't know why anybody would ever go with the 8084 as opposed to the 860 because of that. So you do end up with some real funk. I've only seen it happen once, and it is the weirdest looking modeled concrete ever. It's very strange. And typically I'd find that clients would probably get a little bit upset about it. Last thing about concrete color is the way that they have the colors on their brochure and the way that they have their colors online here that you can see is alphabetical, which is no help at all, okay? So if you look at these colors, let's just go into the grays. So dark gray is a 6 pounds of, it's a liquid dose of 6 pounds per sack of cement. So that's 6 pounds of the iron oxide. And if we go to light gray, that is 3 pounds of iron oxide per 94 pound sack of cement. Okay, and that 94 pound sack of cement is 1 sack of the 6 sack mix. Okay. So it's really just lighter or heavier doses of this color that goes into the concrete. Now, if you're kind of looking around and saying, well, you know, I sort of like cocoa, maybe, or maybe I like Cliffside Brown, right? Well, let's look at Cliffside Brown. That's a little over 3 pounds of liquid dose per 94 pound sack of cement. So sometimes though, you know, like people say, oh, it looks like it's got a little pink in it. I mean, sometimes I can see that, but other people are much better at seeing colors in things than I am. So what I tend to do is if somebody says they like the Cliffside Brown, then I'm going to try and find another color that is the same number. Here's Cliffside Brown at 3.28 pounds per sack of cement. Here's Lakeside Brown. This is over 6 pounds of 6804. And so this is like the root to that color. Let's see if there's any other 6804s. Yeah, here's one, Roadside Brown. So this would probably be a lighter, right? This is 1.64 pounds per sack of cement. So you can see like the actual like base to that color is really like a tan brown. Spots where you can start getting into trouble are Mesquite. Mesquite's kind of a weird one, 677. So if there's ever like a question, then I always recommend that you look at the heavier doses to see which direction it went. So here's Mesquite at 677. Here's Taupe. That's a 2.36 pound, and the Mesquite is a 1.18 pound, okay? So you can see that the root, like the base color to that is sort of a darker brown. Whereas if people start to go into like the sangrias or something, you can see, you can start following that back to see that, you know, there's a real pink to that tone at the heavier dose rates. Okay, so you really want to be careful because, you know, last thing you want to do is have somebody upset with their color selection and choose to rip out their concrete, because at that point, You can either go over it with a tile or a stone, or rip it out and replace it, or do an overlay, which isn't that recommended, etc. Okay, so concrete, you know, again, if it's a full load of concrete, then it is typically a $2,500 to $3,500 per truckload. At the same time, you've probably already done about $2,000 to $3,000 of work anyways to begin with, to set up for that concrete pour. And then you have about $1,500 worth of finishers on site for that day and a $600 pump service fee, right? So in that, you know, 3 days of work and the 1 day of putting that concrete down, it's a lot of money that's going into that. And so you need to be very careful about it and very aware of it. Any questions about like where we've gotten to with concrete itself at this point? Perfect. So I'm gonna plop into, we're gonna take a break pretty shortly here. I'd say we'll take a break in probably about 10 minutes, okay? So I'm gonna dive into the next portion of this, which is nope. Yep. This one. Stone. I think based on the looks of all these, all of this is stone on concrete. Without a doubt, this one in the lower right is stone on concrete. These are square cut pieces of stone. This one up upper right is square cut stone as well. These others are natural cut stone, and these may be on sand. So stone can either be sand or gravel set. Typically, it's a concrete base with stone mortared onto it. It's expensive. It's a very expensive endeavor, typically at least twice the cost of concrete. And the stone itself, where we live, typically the stone that's going to get laid down is either from Nevada, and that'd be like southern Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Montana, Wyoming, some from Idaho, a lot from Midwest and East. So this lower right-hand picture is Connecticut bluestone. And that comes from Connecticut and Pennsylvania. It's a really widely used stone because it's a relatively easy one to work with. And it's, you know, frankly, it's a, you know, a very beautiful color. It doesn't have a whole lot of like surface imperfections. When we're looking at this stuff, one of the best sites that I use is Linkso Garden Materials. It's got pricing on there for me. It's got, so if you want to look at products, this is a pretty fun one to go to. If you're ever in the Bay Area on the peninsula, this is a great rock yard to stop by. They always, they bring in rock that is quite attractive. So they have really good buyers, and they search for really good stone. So when we're looking at stones, one of them is dimensional stone. So these would be typically square cut, Arizona sandstone snap cut pavers. Okay, so you can get these. They are typically dimensionally pretty spot on. Typically thickness varies, and that's why setting it on mortar is typically a lot easier to do in terms of installation than to try and set it on a sand bed or a mortar bed. And that's because a sand bed or a gravel bed. And that's because as you're setting this stuff, if you're putting on a mortar and it's a thinner stone, you just add some mortar and push that down to the right height. If it is, if you're setting it on sand and you have a bunch of thick pieces, then the next piece you're gonna have to, thanks Mason, you're gonna have to put more sand or gravel down in order to get that thinner piece installed. But this stuff is pretty easy to use in terms of like creating walkways, like loose walkways with joints between them. And even then I actually do mortar set these. They're relatively inexpensive. So a 24-inch by 24-inch is $55. So if we break that down into a per square foot price, we're gonna do 55 divided by 4. So it's $13.75 per square foot. Okay, I guess it's a little expensive. Other dimensional, and obviously these stones are typically from Arizona, New Mexico, southern Utah, and it's typically a very soft sandstone. Colors on the Arizona, and they're called Arizona flagstones. They vary from tans to whites to even like deep Sedona reds. The Sedona reds tend to be very soft. In fact, so soft that they'll erode through weather. So they'll soften a little bit and lose some of their, stone. Literally, the sand will wash away. These tanner ones tend to be a little bit more stable, a little bit more dense, but still, these are very workable stones. They're very easy to cut. They're very easy to chisel. And typically, they're pretty uniform in terms of the top of the stone. Even this one that is looks sort of rough, it's not huge clefts on it that can tend to stub toes, etc. There's some slate, some limestone, some basalt, bluestone. So bluestone, this is it's always called Connecticut bluestone. However, it does come from Connecticut and Pennsylvania. It's rare that you hear it called Pennsylvania bluestone. A lot of times you hear Connecticut blue or con blue or just bluestone. There are 3 different grades to it. Connecticut, well, there's multiple grades. So this one, full color, has everything from a blue to a lilac, gray, and rust. Okay, so you have a very variegated look, which is really like that lower left-hand picture that we have here. Okay, so this patio is a full range Connecticut bluestone patio. You can get it, this one's only available in 1-inch thickness, and the cost on it is only $26.20 per piece, right? So think about that. We just looked at the Arizona flagstones, obviously coming from the Southwest. That's $55 per square foot, or per 4 square foot. So about 13 bucks a square foot. Whereas this full range Connecticut bluestone is about $27. So it's about $6.75 per square foot for the material cost. Okay, installed, it's significantly more. But it's interesting that this product that comes from at least twice as far away from where we're doing our work is half the cost of the Arizona flagstones. It used to not really be the case that it was that much of a discrepancy, and it could have to do with honestly, it could have to do with transportation and COVID. It could have to do with new regulations in the Southwest for mining and quarries. It has to do with a lot of things. Yeah, it's a bit of a, anyways, so prices vary. Sam asked, do you have a supplier that I like for stone in the Sacramento area? A&A Stepping Stone actually has a really, really good selection. And part of the reason, Silverado, which is now called something else, right? It's like Henry's Landscape Supply or something. It changed its name. The Silverado building materials down on Jackson Road, they actually have an incredible stone selection, a really, really good stone selection. As you guys know, I really like Cascade rock, but the only rock like stone that they actually have are irregular shaped flagstone. They don't carry any dimensional stone. But I'd say around here, it's either going to be Silverado Building Supply or A&A Stepping Stone. But the part of the reason they have such good selection is they are pulling in these different Connecticut bluestones and Arizona flagstones, et cetera. Occasionally they'll buy something else really weird, like glacier blue boulders, which this is my personal taste, but it's a hideous looking stone. It's like a bright fluorescent green. And some of you guys saw the project down on Morse. The client liked the most hideous stuff in the world, and he went ape poop for this glacier green stuff. But I'm gonna install it, it's fine. But Silverado had it all, and they had good selection. They're actually really nice to deal with. But A&A Stepping Stone and Silverado, I don't think either of them have very good websites, and I tend to do my searches on sites. Ape poop, yes. Yeah, I've got, my kids are around, so, but yes, he did go ape poop for it. Anyways, yeah, those would probably be the best two suppliers. However, Stone Universe is a supplier that yes, Stone Universe. So this is a vendor or a manufacturer, and these guys bring in stone from all over the world. And if you're really looking, then this is a good spot to look for, you know, different specific applications. And they have good product. They have really good product. They've got a great, I probably have one of their brochures or catalogs around here somewhere. But both Silverado and A&A Stepping Stone stock all this stuff, so it's pretty easy to get. And it is very uniform. And so if you need ledger stone or eased edge stones or column caps, you know, it's pretty easy to get all these things. And the major supplier now for these bulk vendors is typically Stone Universe. So you can do a search there for what's available, or MSI. I'm probably going to get some weird stuff there. But anybody that was, where were we? Oh, it was the last class, right? When I found all the bongs. So I'm going to try and stay out of the bongs today and get into stone. Here's MSI Stone. So they carry slabs, products, hardscaping. There we go. So this is also another like major importer of stone from around the world. And sometimes we end up here. I really prefer to use, I really try to steer clients in at least something that comes from the United States, right? I mean, sure, India has like phenomenal different types of stones. Europe has great stone. There's a ton of really amazing granite that comes out of China, but you got to really think about where it's coming from. And so I always start with the Arizonas, the basalts, the Connecticut blues, some from Wyoming and Montana. I always try to start with those, and then if the project warrants it, I do try and push local granite because it's local, right? It's coming from less than 200 miles away. But a lot of people look at granite, like it's not for every situation. And then if you also look at the cost of California granite versus the cost of China granite, China granite is way less expensive. But, you know, it's the client's decision. I just have to steer them in a direction of here's what's more sustainable. And here's why. And then the other thing that I think we went through when we went through Act Local is that, you know, that crate gets put onto a shipping container and it arrives and you own it. And if it doesn't come out quite right, there's some major issues. But a lot of stone does get put into shipping containers and hauled out here. For my big project in Penryn, it was 2.5 shipping containers that came in via train from Pennsylvania. Almost all, I think all of it was custom sizes. And it was about $75,000 worth of material. I used my stone supplier through Granite Rock, and he works out of Redwood City, but I've been working with him for so long that it's him, his name is Michael. And then I also work with this guy, Earl, that they both could find me whatever I need. They're incredibly helpful and they will absolutely pull through. And I trust what they're getting me. Searching for price, you know, you're only going to drive the price one way or another very slightly. So anyways, I'm always leery of stone that's coming from across seas. I don't like bringing it here. I'd prefer to keep my selections to like the Western United States, but ultimately my clients in Penryn, even though there's granite boulders everywhere on the project, there's huge granite slabs and grinding stones from the Native Americans that are all granite. They still looked at the local granite and they said, nope, I want Connecticut bluestone. So we shipped a bunch of bluestone out. The granite would have been probably significantly more. It probably would have been 100,000, 120,000 for the material. Anyways, long way to answer your question, Sam. Start on websites. And like I said, I almost always start on Linkso's website, because a lot of the vendors from the Sacramento area will model almost everything that they're doing off of Linkso's model. Linkso's been around for a long time. They're a really good contributor to sustainability. In fact, you can get actively aerated compost tea there. They really do a good job in terms of supplying materials, and most of them come from the United States. And then, then there's all these others, and really, you can get anything you want. The only thing that I'd really caution you on is, here, I'll caution you on this one. This one got really popular in the early 2000s. Three Rivers flagstone. It is a disco and a half. People like in the early 2000s, they love this stuff. They're like, it's so pretty. I don't think it's available anymore. At the same time, we did a big project that they got, and this is the first time that it bit me. They got Double Horn Creek Quarry, is that it? Maybe not. Save Spice Wood. Oh, I might be falling into a bad zone here. Anyways, it was a similar stone to the Three Rivers, but it got discontinued when we were, we ended up having to buy, somebody told us that it was discontinued and there was going to be a future phase of the project. Luckily, we knew our vendors and they said, hey, this thing, they shut down that quarry. So we ended up having to buy an extra 3 pallets of it. So, using those tried and trues, just like a lot with plants that have been around for a long time. You got to be cautious of using a plant that's like, oh my God, this is the newest, latest, greatest. Look at how pink and like brilliant those flowers are. And it's a brand new cultivar and you plant 500 of them. And then 2 years down the road, or even within, let's say a year down the road, and 50 of them die, but nobody's growing it anymore. That's a problem. With a stone, that's why going with sort of the tried and true stuff that's been around for a long time, is used a lot. You know that you can get another batch of it, like the Arizonas, the Connecticut's, the basalts. Basalts are very uniform. If you have to replace a stone, or the clients want to do a future phase, or there's anything like that, just be cautious of using like the obscure ones that you find. And then be also cautious of the fact that this kind of lilac, tan, white, yellow, blue, green color might go out of style at some point. So, and it's not your fault if the clients don't have good taste, right? But just warn them that it might not always be in style. And if you have this stone, it looks really cool. And I did install a lot of it. Oh, sweet. Larry the Sandblaster will be on site on Thursday. Did you get that, Kyle? I see you got that, Kyle. Perfect. Anyways, yes. The actual stones themselves, last thing that I really want to drive home on stone, and I think I'll pop back into Linkso for this. Let me just finish here. The full range color, the full color blue stone has all those different colors. The blue colored Connecticut bluestone is a much more uniform, much darker, and has little to no rust colors in it. However, it does come at a more handsome price tag. Okay, so this is 36 bucks, still less than that slab of Arizona we're looking at, but it is more expensive because it's either coming from specific quarries or they're pulling it from specific veins within that quarry. The other thing to this is you can see that there are some clefts to this, right? There's some like variation in the surface, okay? Which isn't necessarily a really bad thing, although when you are setting these things adjacent to each other and one has an odd cleft jump and the one next to it doesn't, it can make for like a weird spot where people can really stub their toes. So it makes the installation a lot more challenging. So when you're looking for stones, or, you know, I never just say, hey, yes, send me out a pallet of stone, because I want to look at the stone and make sure that, you know, we're not getting a ton of clefts on it. So it is important to look at that piece of it. Let's take a quick break. It's 3:23. Let's do a long one. Sorry, I was yapping forever, and I can tell Amanda's spent. But she has a little baby, so that's okay. So let's go to 3:45. Okay, so a little over 20 minutes. We'll break and then we'll jump back in. Thank you. Where's my thing? There it is. Stop share. Oops. Sorry about that, everybody. I had to have somebody stop by to look at some mushrooms that we found in our wall, which is always super awesome. Anyways, so back into it. The last thing that I really want you guys to understand, sort of at a really high level, there's a lot of stuff about stone that there's nuances and this and that. But in terms of like just stone selection, the piece that I said about making sure that things aren't too cleft. So there's dimensional stones. Here's irregular flagstones. Oh, I'm not sharing anything, huh? Dork. Here we go. Okay, so here's irregular flagstones. Again, we've got all the Arizona flagstones: buckskin, buff, classic oak, peach, rosa, Sedona red. This Sedona red's the one that like literally is so soft that it just erodes. Per ton, $375 a ton. Generally, usually they have like a rating for like how much square footage you get per ton. Anyways, I'm trying to get in, here we go. So never send a client to a stone yard alone to pick out stone. Okay, just, it's not something you want to do. They'll pick out something stupid. And you want to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it's going to make the cost go up to install it. And what happens a lot is this happens to me no, actually it doesn't happen to me all the time. It used to, before I started not letting them go, that clients would pick Bouquet Canyon. This is a beautiful stone. Let's see. Well, I mean, look at the description. Bouquet Canyon is a schist. Hard, dense stone, schist. I like that. I don't even know what that means. Sam, do you know what that means? Sam, can you let me know what schist is? I'm going to pull up. And if you know right off the top of your head, I'm going to be like genius. Anyways, it's this certain type of stone. Typically comes in very small pieces. It's rare to get it larger than like 18 by 18. And it's like, it is a gorgeous stone. It's got a lot of micas in it. It's very like shimmery. It's a beautiful gray with some pretty browns in it. The problem with it is that there's so much variation typically in like the top surface that you would use. It makes it very, very hard to get a nice walkable surface out of it. So that's sort of the story behind it. Is you got to be able to look at the stone and look at how flat the top is, look at how large the pieces are, to be able to make a good decision and say, yes, this is a good palette or a bad palette. Because it'll happen a lot with the Arizona flagstones and the Connecticut blue flagstones. So the Connecticut blues can be just as bad in terms of clefting, especially in the natural. You know, these kind of heavy clefts that you see in that, yeah, there's some really heavy clefts in that. So when you're looking at the standing palette itself, you can't break them open, but you can look through and try and get your best take, and you can tag those palettes and get the ones that are going to be the easiest to work with. So, you know, those are the kind of the key pieces that I've learned in order to make sure that, you know, you're getting a product that you can really use, and you're kind of like not getting the crappiest one. But if you don't know what to look for, you have no idea if you're getting the crappiest one or not. And even how straight a piece is. I've had Arizona flagstones. I tend to use buckskin a fair amount. I like the tan color to it. buckskin and buff. But I've even ended up with it where like a big old piece of it, like a 2.5 foot piece, we couldn't tell, but it was bowed. And so we were trying to get it to fit into this spot. And no matter what we did, we couldn't get it to actually work because it wouldn't line up with the adjacent stones. And finally, somebody just put a level on it and you could see that the thing was bowed up, you know, very slightly, but it made it so that it just wouldn't work. So, you know, I don't want to scare you, but just if you're going to pick out stone, these are the really basic things that you want to be looking for. And again, do not bring your client or send your clients alone to the store to pick stone. You want to go there and guide them. In my opinion, though, it's better just to bring them chunks of stones that you can edit and let them pick from those. A supervisor I worked with a long time ago, who I've probably told you, I would show up while he's working on the project with the flagstone for samples, and he'd come up and he'd look and he's like, take like 4 of those away. Just show up with 2, let him pick from the 2, and that's it. And ultimately, he was probably right. You know, it's rare that I bring more than 3 samples, but sometimes it's a project that warrants it. Anyways, that's like my spiel on stone. It takes a long time to understand it. It takes a long time to learn how to work with it. Kyle's company that's putting in the big pieces of very heavy stone up in Penryn, they actually got a, because the pieces are so damn big, they got like a tool that fits onto an air compressor that suction cups it so that they can pick it up, which is super cool. I know they spent a pretty penny on it, but when you're working with big stone, I would recommend doing it. And just like I mentioned, or getting those tools that are really important. And just like with the concrete, if you've got like a little bit of stone to put here and there, or like a little walkway to do out of flagstone on a project, if you're going into this, you know, without going to work for somebody else for a long time, go ahead and do it. But hire a concrete masonry company, hire a mason to actually do the work. Until you've watched them do the work so many times, I wouldn't recommend just deciding you can do everything. It's okay to subcontract work. In fact, as long as you've got enough work, it just means that per hour you're making more money. And so, you know, I would really highly recommend watching some professionals do it for a long time before saying, nah, I can do it and I can do it better. Because there's risk involved. It's all very expensive material, and the less opportunity you give yourself to screw up, the better off you are. You can put that onto a quote that was from me. That's one I should listen to more often. Okay, so back into this, and from here we're going into current slide. There we go, and swap. There we go. Okay, so this is stones. Oops, and I move something. Yeah, and again, typically these stones are sourced from more than 500 miles away. This middle lower picture, you know, now that I look at this, I think this is a total scam here. This almost looks to me like it is a paver, a concrete paver. Anyways, that's that. Now, on to concrete interlocking pavers. There's a phenomenal amount of options with concrete interlocking pavers. There's tons of different colors. There's tons of different textures too, right? You've got this one that is probably the calstone quarry stone or something like it. So it's got like a little bit of a stone effect to it. This one's actually kind of cool. This is like an arabesque tile pattern that I actually recently used this in terracotta on this Mediterranean project. And I love the pattern. I wish that the pavers were a little larger, but it's a very cool, like elegant looking pattern. These other ones are ones that we see much more often, you know, in terms of what's going in these days. These are all pretty popular. Other thing, which is like the last piece of this is that, or on this bullet point, is that this lower left-hand one, these are all permeable pavers, okay? So they have a much larger nub on the side of them, and these are designed to be drivable, but it allows the water to flow through it, right? So this is actually like a very sustainable approach. The other piece to pavers that is really nice, and you know, in terms of the material itself, it's concrete, right? It's the same ingredients as concrete. It's cement, aggregate, sand. And then they typically have color in there. They'll typically have some sort of polymer in there for greater strength, but they have a much higher compressive strength than concrete itself. And the reason that is because these are put into molds, and the concrete, when it goes in, they're pressed. Okay, so because it's pressed, they can get a better compressive strength out of it. So the concrete in pavers has a higher compressive strength than any other normal concrete, like we talked about before. And then the other piece to it is that these are reusable in whole form, where concrete that's poured and placed, and then once it's outlived its life or we're tired of it, it gets broken up, it gets taken off, it gets ground up, and it's made into an aggregate-based material. It's recycled, right? But it is remanufactured. So a lot of carbon has to go into that breaking process. Pavers, on the other hand, they can literally be picked up, repalletized, and used on any other project, right? So if that's not part of like your scheme, right? If you're looking at this going, well, I don't like the pavers that are on this project and they're going to be changed. We're going to use different pavers, or we're going to go all gravel or something, blah, blah, blah. You can literally put it on Craigslist and say, U-Haul free pavers. And somebody's going to come out there and grab those things, palletize them, load them up, and put them on a different project, right? And that is reused in whole form. Or if you have a yard that's big enough, right, that you can handle some extra materials at, then repalletize them, take them off site, you use them on a different project, maybe where the clients don't have a huge budget. So they do have to pay for your labor to store them, move them, relocate them, blah, 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 right? You need to recover that money. But pavers are wonderful because they can be reused in whole form, right? So that gets it going on that embedded energy piece cyclically and doesn't ever kick out or pass through that manufacturing process again, okay? That's one reason why it's a really, really good product. The locally manufactured piece. Now, there are many, I don't know if there's any companies locally that are like Calstone. Usually the way that it works is there's a paver company, they come up with the patterns, the mixes, the molds, etc. And then a set of those patterns, mixes, molds goes out to a manufacturing facility that's relatively local. So I don't know where they are in the Sacramento area, but I do know that in the Bay Area, in Cupertino, there's a Calstone factory there. And so that product is actually getting made right there, like right in the heart of Cupertino. And that product is going locally out to places. So that piece is a nice local piece. It is a flexible product. So if pavers don't crack, right? Concrete will crack. You have to joint it so that it cracks in controlled spots. Pavers, on the other hand, they might sink if there's a problem or move a little bit if they're not installed right, or if something too heavy drives on it, right? There's a lot of reasons for it, but they're flexible, so you're not losing it, right? You can pull up that section of it, repair it, put it back. Okay, so there's some big benefits to using pavers, and for the most part, you know, the majority of the pavers out there today, I really love the appearance. You can get a great appearance out of them. As I mentioned, you know, I'm sort of a fan of it just being concrete. I just like plain old concrete. And so if there's just plain old pavers that are sort of large format, from a design standpoint, I can really appreciate those. When I first started into the industry, I had recently been laying a lot of pavers. And I actually love the process of laying pavers, as long as it's not like 2,000 square feet, right? If it's a reasonable amount, it's actually a pretty fun process. So, you know, I was pretty into pavers, but once I started learning new products, I didn't phase out of liking them. I still really like them, but I don't use them as often as I should. And then last note on here is that they're typically sand or gravel set on a base of concrete. I'm sorry, of base rock. A typical walkway for pedestrian traffic, you'd usually have 4 inches of base rock, 1 inch of leveling sand, and then you would put the pavers on top of that. And what makes them interlocking pavers is what you don't see on this picture here. Maybe I can bring up a good picture of it. Is that there's even on the ones that are not permeable. The ones that are not permeable, here we go, perfect. They have these little nubs on them. Oh, Lowe's my favorite. So there's these little separating nubs that each one is set off just a little bit from the next, and it leaves about, you know, a 1/16 of an inch or a little bit more of space between each paver. And you typically put sand into that, and that's what actually locks the whole thing together, hence the name interlocking pavers. Now, what happens more often than not is polymer sand is used, and once it's wetted, then it seals that gap in so that less weed seeds can get in there, because that can be a problem with pavers, driveways, etc. It is a good, you know, it's a good thing to use that polymer sand for weed prevention, but you know, I don't know what polymers they're using in it, so I could go on a rant about that this time. The permeable pavers typically come in a couple different flavors. So these ones here, and I'm trying to get one that I can. So this one here, you can see that the nubs on the side of them are a little bit larger, so it leaves a larger gap. And we talked about that when we talked about the stormwater stuff a couple weeks ago. And you fill that with typically a manufactured pea gravel. So you keep that gravel in it. That is the interlocking portion of it, but it's gravel so that water can flow through. That does change the substrate that you use, or the leveling base, to a gravel base. And you usually do have a couple layers of the filter fabric between it. But again, you've got this big expansive area and you're using a permeable product. So you're really cutting significantly down on the amount of volume of runoff water that you're creating. The other flavor of permeable paver, so I guess this is a pretty good look at how those actually work. Some are more attractive than others, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Here is a set of them getting laid down. So this is a great picture. So you can see that there's pretty heavy separation between the two, and there is gravel below all of this. So it allows the water to flow through. They also have a permeable paver itself, where and there's also permeable concrete. And that's where when they're making it, they go pretty high on the actual sack mix of cement, but they do not use the sand. So it creates kind of a Rice Krispie treat look. It literally looks like a concrete Rice Krispie treat. I'm not sure, to me, if it's the most attractive thing in the world. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Perfect. So to me, not the most attractive thing in the world, but you got to think about what it's actually doing and the benefits to it. Okay. I'm sure that this could be used for some sort of very wonderful application. I would prefer the larger offset pavers to the permeable concrete. And permeable concrete looks the same. It's just one large slab. It is pretty amazing, though, that they can make this product that literally, like, water just pours completely through it. I don't know what the online plant locations. So here's one. So these guys, they've got, these are obviously, this is a Florida manufacturer. So they've got, or a Florida company, but they've got manufacturers all over Florida, right? So where it's actually being made is very close to your project location. I don't know why I picked a Florida company. It's just what popped up. Anyways, I guess they've got a lot more too, huh? Looks like all over the Southeast. Cool. So.
Hey, Chayla.
Yeah.
When you use those, is drainage still a major concern, or is that something that you can kind of like circumvent by using permeable concrete and pavers?
Great question. Typically what you find is they do want some sort of under drain. If a civil engineer is designing this, they'll usually put in some sort of under drain under it, because and it'll depend on the soil that you have. So if you're in a really clay soil, then you know that, yeah, sure, that water is going to blast through that stuff, but what it finds on the bottom side, it's just going to pool up and go, right? If it's a really sandy soil, you could probably rely on that taking on quite a bit of water, but I would say that you probably want some sort of safety drain, just in case you end up in a weird situation. And I used to, the first time a civil engineer designed one of these into a project, we were required to use permeable paving for a portion of the driveway. And so the civil engineer designed it. And at first I looked at it and I was like, that's the stupidest thing ever. Like, it's a permeable paving. Like, why are we going to collect that water and put it right into the storm drain? Ultimately, we moved where it flushed out into, so that it went across soil. But it was before I know what little I know of soil. So you do have to think about all the systems involved. And if you're sitting on clay, you can be sure that it's going to get pretty yucky. So you probably definitely still think about drainage, but as opposed to surface drainage, it's going to be less so than the sub drainage. But slope, you have to worry about slope as much with it. I'm gonna have to ask. That's a really good question. I'll have to ask. I know that a civil would design slope into it, but I'm wondering if you could avoid sloping it. I'll check. Okay. Back at it. So interlocking pavers. Oh, and there are some really great new products, such as what is that stuff called? So we've got, there we go. On Gator base, not Gator pad. So Gator base, we're seeing like quite a bit more of these kind of technologies and new products come into play these days. So these are actually like tile pads. These ones are made by the Gator company that came up with Gator Sand, Gator Bay, I don't know, whatever the kind of Gator products they've got. Gator Grout, lots of stuff. Anyways, what this does is this makes it so that you have to excavate far less. And if you're dealing with problematic soils or issues with, you know, the ability to import and export materials, so tough to reach sites, tight access, really steep hills, etc. There's these panels that are made that you lay down geofabric, so the Mira Fa2000 or whatever, and then you put bedding sand down, you set these tiles in place that link together, and then you set the pavers right on top of that. So you end up with a much less of a profile. So a normal profile for a paver system for pedestrian access would be 4 inches of base rock, an inch of sand makes 5, and a little over 2 inches of paver makes a little over 7 inches of a profile, right? So if you're installing this patio at, you know, at grade or 2 inches above grade, you've got to figure out how to get rid of 5 inches of material before you start building back up. What systems like this make possible is a much shallower profile that you're going in with. So it makes the movement of materials around the valley, the excavation operations, the throwing it into a dumpster or a dump truck or sending off to a hauler and moving that soil somewhere else, it eliminates that piece. So, you know, this kind of application can be a really, really wise application for certain things. My guess is how fast it goes in is, I haven't used it. Kyle, you guys have used it, right? You want to take yourself off of mute and tell us the success stories or the hate stories?
Yeah, I was actually just typing it in the chat. It works phenomenal. Couple reasons why. First off, like you said, the lack of excavation. So it's for backyards, we use it. That's when we only use it. We don't ever use it in front yards in case somebody decides to get crazy with driving, because it is not vehicular rated at all. And it'll compress it because it's only made out of a foam. But then the second thing is ease of installation, because you can first off walk on your base after it's all set. So you don't have to, you can literally lay your whole base. Like normally on pavers, you have your gravel or your sand set, and you can't walk on it. You're literally trying to monkey around without messing up your base with that. With the Gator base, you can walk on it. So getting pavers to where you're setting them, way easier. And then the other thing that we learned is, like, we were doing a circle pack one, and if we didn't use Gator base, we would have been screwed, because the nice thing was, like, on the circle pack, you have to get your gaps right, because the way they're designed is you literally have to go around and just like move every single one to the perfect width on the circle pack. We were able to set the majority of the circle pack and then go back and readjust and slide them around without having to redo our base. So it saved us like a ton of time.
You're talking about
a circle,
right?
like, yep. That is exactly what I'm talking about.
Got it.
So we were like, if you like, those ones are pretty tight gaps, but you use all different stones. Like if you look at it, there's different gaps depending on which stone you have, because they don't all fit that tight all the time. So we are literally able to go through and adjust and pull out a paver and change it to a different one without having to, because there's not really they give you the formula for the first 3 feet of a circle, but then past that, they're like, yeah, just set pavers in there of this size until you get to where you want. So with that, it made it really easy to do stuff like that. And then the other thing is, like, if we're doing like a walkway or something, it's really nice because one person can lay out all your stuff, and then the second person, instead of lifting them up and setting them, literally you're just sliding them into place on top of the base. So you're not having to lift them and set them perfectly in there without messing with grades. You literally just pull them towards you and slide it across the top of the gator base. It's way faster during installation processes. So yeah, the excavation is nice, but the really nice part is the installation side of it is what we noticed.
Nice. And so do you guys sell the paver like jobs at same cost or more or less?
It ends up being about the same with what we normally, depending on the job and how much base I'm ordering, it's $3.50 a square foot is what we have to charge for that base. I'm pretty sure is what it is. I'd have to look it up. But
Installed and compacted?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's just for the gator base.
Oh, just
because it's pretty expensive. It's like $15 for one of those boards.
Got it.
It's like $15.75.
Oh,
So by the time you break that down, because it's like 530 it's like 5.3 square feet or something. It's weird because we end up it's literally like $15 per piece.
Got it.
So it is pricey up front, but it really does save a ton of time. And then Home Depot makes a brand that's cheaper, which we gave a shot also, just because we're like, oh, let's try it. It's still a comparable product, but the difference between it, and I think theirs is a Brock product over there. It's Brock something. But the paver base it interlocks versus the Brock product just overlaps. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So you just have to make sure that they're aligned, but they can still slide.
Correct.
Cool. Nice. Thanks, Kyle.
And yes,
I appreciate it.
It is made of foam. It's a high density foam is what it's made out of.
Awesome. And really, there's foam being made, but so that might not be the best thing in the world. I would imagine that hopefully some of it is recycled content. But in terms of moving materials around the valley, heavy excavation, using heavy equipment on projects to create the same thing versus not having to do that and using all essentially manual labor, but way lighter to deal with, certainly from a sustainable standpoint, is a pretty big bonus. Nice. Thanks, Kyle. Okay, last pieces here are interlocking pavers, decomposed granite. I know that we're probably all familiar with decomposed granite itself. It is a great product. Things to know about it though, typically locally sourced, depending on where you are. Typically there's a decomposed granite quarry or source from pretty nearby. Some of the best decomposed granite I've ever used is out of Hollister, California. And it's primarily the one that I use when I'm working in the Bay. It packs together incredibly well. It is a granite product, and it is varied in size from 1/4 inch to fines. There's different grades of it. Typically, just a normal decomposed granite is perfectly fine. There's all sorts of different ratings to it. There's gold fines, there's track fines, there's all sorts of things. The only spots that I find those things that are available are from real specialty suppliers. The only one that I really use is in, I think it's San Jose, is TMT Enterprises. And they have all the, sports fields mixes, so infield baseball mixes, all that kind of like really specific stuff. And they do mix up a lot of green roof stuff, so they do a lot of custom blends. Anyways, you can get different grades. The real basic grade though, it should be good and compactable. Typically, the way that I install it is 1 to 2 inches of the decomposed granite onto 3 to 4 inches of base rock, compacted base rock. So the full profile is 4 to 6 inches thick. And the decomposed granite is much more expensive than base rock. So I tend to use the base rock as the base portion and then top it with the decomposed granite. You can also just use a 3 to 4 inch thick layer of the decomposed granite compacted. It does weather and erode, right? When rain hits this stuff, it moves. Okay, so it's hard to keep it pristine. If your clients need a pristine surface, this is not the surface, because it does sort of degrade just like any natural product will. Given that you do need slope on this stuff, but what you want to make sure is that they're very slight and they're very short. So that being said, on a pathway, you wouldn't want to do like a 30-foot pathway and just slope the whole 30 feet of pathway all the way down. Okay, you don't want that as your slope, because you got water traveling for a really long period of time or across a very long surface. So you'd want to put some cross slope into it, so that instead of going down the full 30 feet, it's only going like 5 feet across and it's coming off on one or the other side. Because if water gets to moving on this stuff, you will get rills in it. And you can see in spots where people do it, you can see where it erodes. And now that I've mentioned it, you'll look at it and say, you shouldn't have done that. But you see it a lot, but just know that it will do that. It is typically edged with some sort of header board, typical, but not required, because it's a compactable surface. So this one has a pretty like heavily raised header board here. This looks like steel. This one here looks like a composite header board. This one here is just bordered by some La Paz stone or some black Mexican pebbles, right up to a concrete patio. And it looks like there's no, real formal edging on this. If you don't edge it, if you don't have a header board on it, it's important to get like a bevel on the side of it. So don't like go vertical face on the edge of this, because it will like crumble down. So if you turn it and bevel it, like we have talked about with the edge of lawn, right? If you've got mulch going right up to lawn, you don't want a vertical surface or vertical edge of lawn and the lawn soil and then mulch going right up to it, because it's going to wick stuff out. You want it beveled in a way that the mulch can come up to that that decomposed granite, and that the decomposed granite won't like tend to chip and erode too quickly on the edge there. Keep it away from hardwood floors. Right, you do not want a decomposed granite walkway going right up to the back door where there's like a 3-foot landing, and kids are going to come in and out and scratch up hardwood floors. Decomposed granite without edging is usually about $5-6 a square foot installed. Hardwood floors installed are a ape poop amount of money, right? Those per square foot, I mean, you're dropping, $20,000 to $50,000 on those very nice hardwood floors. Don't screw them up with $6 a square foot worth of decomposed granite. So be aware of that piece. Other thing to be aware of is it does wick moisture, okay? So if there's moisture in the ground, there's moisture falling from above, it's such a tight makeup of sizes of aggregate, from 1/4 inch minus down to like little itty bitty, literally like seems like clay particles. So that kind of composition really tends to pull water into it, and it'll hold it because it has such small particles in it. So if you've got like an area that remains wet in the wintertime or is on like the north side of a building, you can anticipate that that will be a little bit soggy in the wintertime. And if it's in the shade on the north side of the building, you can also anticipate that you'll probably get some moss growth on it that can look cool for a little while, but then it doesn't look that cool anymore. So just be aware, it's a great product. You know, it's a wonderful, like, I mean, this top right picture, I really love the appearance of this garden, right? It's a beautiful garden. You know, you feel like you can go anywhere, but it feels like it's really well planted. And it's because there's really no borders, right? You can go anywhere, but there are a couple drawbacks to be aware of. And, you know, getting callbacks from clients because their decomposed granite is soggy can be really frustrating, because it's like, dude, of course it's soggy, it's wet, and it's basically dirt. So yes, it's going to be soggy, but you got to let clients know what the pros and cons are to it and understand what you're dealing with. You can also stabilize this product, which means that you can either spray some sort of polymer onto it after the fact or while you're installing it, or you can order pre-stabilized decomposed granite, which has a sustainable stabilizer in it. It's essentially a white powder that's made out of a natural rubber. I can't remember what plant it comes from, but it is just derived right out of a plant. So it's not like some crazy polymer and like we're not poisoning the earth. The only thing that it does do is it does make a somewhat permeable product completely impermeable. While it is much more firm on the top and it looks super cool, it doesn't last forever and it does become pretty much impermeable. So just know that about it. Last one here, which we're at, son of a gun. I knew this one would take a long time to talk about. Last one here is gravel. Okay, so in terms of like hard surfaces, this is really considered a softer surface. But gravel, I love gravel. I do not like gravel that is like 4 inches thick, because it's like walking in soft sand, and that sucks. Unless you're on the beach and you're actually washing it in soft sand, but you're in like a garden, you don't want to be having a tough, challenging surface to walk on. Gravel, typically locally sourced, unless you're buying La Paz or Mexican pebbles or something that is not local. Most pea gravels are local sourced. It is reusable in whole form. It is flexible. In my opinion, unless you're going to reinforce it, it's best to use a 1 to 2 inch layer set on base rock. So really similar to the decomposed granite application, where it's 1 to 2 inch layer set onto a 3 to 4 inch layer of compacted base rock. That way you're only walking through about that much of gravel, and you're not swimming in it as you're walking through it. It is permeable as long as the base rock you use below it is permeable. It is reinforceable. And this is a reinforcing mat for gravel. It is about $3.50 a square foot. This is a filter fabric, and these are high density polyethylene, recyclable, plastic cells that are linked together, and these lock together. You staple them in with giant nails. So what this does is, the only amount of gravel that goes in here is literally as thick as this, plus just enough gravel to cover it so that you can't see this beautiful honeycomb here. And it does make it really, really walkable. Like literally, it sounds like you're walking on gravel, but it feels like you're walking on a very hard surface. All of the gravel in the pictures that you see here has this reinforcing in it. And it does make it ADA accessible. The client at this project, she's in a wheelchair, So she can cruise this whole entire thing. Before we put this gravel in, we did have decomposed granite in it. The challenges to the decomposed granite in this condition was that this is the north side, so there was tons of moss in here. And when she rolled on it on her wheelchair, when it was wet, it left tracks in it. And every couple of years we'd have to come in and retop it. So about a year and a half ago, we came in, pulled it all out and changed it over to this. And I totally love the appearance. Like it looks great now. You know, if you're not into gravel, you're not into gravel. Clearly I like gravel and plain old concrete. But you know, to each their own. It is a great, easy surface to maintain. You can blow it off. It doesn't like create a ton of dust. You can hose it down. It doesn't puddle. If you really want to get crazy neat about it, go over it with like a stiff bristle push broom and it looks like $1 million. Okay, very easy product to use. Typically about $4 a square foot for installed price. Depending on the size and depending on whether it's a pathway or a patio. Patios per square foot, way less expensive. That $4 to $5 a square foot does not include this reinforcement grid. That makes it a lot more. But the reason it ends up getting expensive, especially for the pathways, is because of the header board on it. Because you do need some sort of border on this. With decomposed granite, you don't need a border. It's nice to have one, but it's not mandatory. With gravel, it will go everywhere if you don't contain it. So you do need some sort of header on it. One thing before we switch to talking about, dang it, it's time, about header boards is that the size and shape of the aggregate of the gravel itself determines how walkable it is. A angular gravel that's like 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch can lay down really well and really firm, but it sucks to walk on with bare feet. A rounded pebble is very beautiful and is wonderful to walk on with bare feet, but it tends to move a lot more when you walk on it. So making those selections, when you bring gravel to clients for them to select from, you have to look at it and be able to say, this one's angular, it's gonna suck to walk on with bare feet. This one, you're gonna like it because its appearance is beautiful, it's soft, it's round, it's red, it's pink, whatever, right? All those wonderful things about those types of gravels, but it tends to move a lot more underfoot, okay? Last thing here, in terms of header boards, really quickly, this is edging. This type of edging can be used for lawn, decomposed granite, and gravel. Your options are basically, in terms of a board, are either composite. Redwood used to be used a lot. It still can be used. Pressure treated lumber still can be used, but rarely is it used because it's not outrageously attractive and the redwood tends to rot out relatively quickly. Composites, on the other hand, they warp, but it doesn't maim, okay? So this I just put on here, composite versus steel. Composite will warp, it will move, it will buckle, but if a kid lands their forehead on it, they're not going to the emergency room, they just have to sit on the couch with some ice on their forehead. With steel, it maims, but it doesn't warp, right? Like it will stay in place, it will hold a clean line, it looks beautiful, but if a kid takes a header, you are going to the hospital, okay? So you have to explain that to clients. So I use composite or nothing around lawn, but around gravel, walkways, and decomposed granite, I use steel. And the reason for it is that kids usually play on lawns and they fall on lawns, but you don't want to send them to the hospital. If, you know, I guess they run on pathways too. So like, I guess I don't know what I'm talking about, but it's a safer spot to use it than somewhere where they're like encouraged to run and tackle each other and throw balls. Okay? That is the basics to these types of hard surface materials. All great ones, all ones that I encourage you guys to like go and look at. And literally every time I end up near a a rock yard or a bulk supply place with a little extra time, especially if I'm somewhere where I'm visiting somewhere. So if I'm up in Reading or something and I see a bulk supply place, I want to go and see if they've got something else there that I don't know about. I did a project where, of all things, we used pumice. For some reason, we could get pumice for a walkway, and the clients, they said, let's do it. And it ended up, I was skeptical at first, but it ended up being like one of the coolest gravel pathways I've ever done. Really nice, beautiful white. It floated a lot when it got really wet, but you know, there's products out there that come and go. So again, be leery of using things on massive projects where you might have to replace stuff in the future because you don't want it to be a product that you will never be able to find again. But you know, they're all cool products. Like this product, this gravel in the lower right hand picture, to me, that looks like roofing gravel, right? It looks like 1/4 inch minus, very inexpensive roofing gravel, but it gives you this really wonderful gray appearance. So, you know, go and look, learn about them, feel them, see how dirty they are, wash them off, just check the products out. Like when I was out in Florida a couple weeks ago, this is the gravel that they've got. It's like white limestone, right? And I was like, heck yeah, like I don't have to source it. I don't have to find anything weird. Like we're using this. This is literally like just what's on their site. And the larger pieces are like, this is like riprap that they use, right? This one's kind of cruddy, but the boulders that they have on site are this beautiful limestone tan. So, you know, get to know what's out there. Looking for quarries is always cool. There's quarries in weird spots. And I found some of the best, coolest stuff for the least expensive at quarries. And they're everywhere. They're in places you'd never expect. So just keep an eye out, look at rock, like just literally like look around and go, boy, that's used for like this dam, but that's a cool looking rock. I could use that for boulders. And usually you can find that stuff for like $8 a ton if you can buy it direct from the quarry, which, you know, you need a loader and a hauler and all that stuff. But usually you're paying like $100 to $400 per ton for boulders at bulk supply places. So be aware of what's out there locally. I wanted you to be somewhat aware of stone and concrete processes, et cetera. Hopefully it opens some eyes and really, like, again, keep your eyes open for what's out there. And sorry to go over on you. Have a great week. Enjoy yourselves. Go look at rocks, look at concrete, look at joints, not those kind of joints. And have a good one, okay? Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Phil.
Have a good one.
You too, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.